Have you ever wondered why someone pulls away just when things start to feel real, then seems to punish you with silence for crimes you never committed? This invisible dance of emotional withdrawal and quiet retaliation reveals one of the most puzzling patterns in human relationships. When avoidant guilt transforms into silent punishment, it creates a toxic cycle that destroys connections from the inside out, leaving both parties confused, hurt, and desperately searching for answers they cannot name. Picture this scenario with the precision of a master chess player contemplating their next move. Someone with an avoidant attachment style begins to feel close to another person. Their nervous system, finely tuned by years of self-protection, starts sending alarm bells. Intimacy feels dangerous. Vulnerability feels like walking into a trap. So they do what comes naturally. They create distance. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Deep down, beneath all that armor, they know their withdrawal hurts the other person. They feel guilty about it, but admitting that guilt would require the very vulnerability they're trying to avoid. Instead of facing these uncomfortable feelings directly, they transform that guilt into something else entirely. A quiet, persistent form of punishment directed at the person who dared to get too close. The guilt becomes a shapeshifter, morphing into resentment. They begin to blame the other person for making them feel guilty in the first place. It's like blaming the mirror for showing an unflattering reflection. This psychological sleight of hand allows them to maintain their self-protective walls while justifying their increasingly cold behavior. The person who once brought them joy now represents everything they fear about emotional connection. The loss of control, the risk of being hurt, the terrifying possibility of being truly known. But here's what makes this pattern so insidious and worth understanding completely. The silent punishment rarely looks like obvious cruelty. Instead, it manifests as 1,000 tiny cuts. Delayed responses to messages, emotional unavailability during important moments, withholding affection, attention, or validation. Creating emotional distance through busyness, distraction, or simply being perpetually unreachable. Each action seems small and potentially explainable on its own, but together they form a comprehensive system of emotional withdrawal designed to push the other person away while avoiding direct confrontation. This behavior serves multiple functions for the avoidant person. It satisfies their need for distance and control. It punishes the other person for triggering their discomfort. And most cleverly, it often provokes the exact response that confirms their deepest fears about relationships, that people will eventually leave, get angry, or become demanding. When the other person finally reacts with frustration or hurt, the avoidant individual can point to that reaction as proof that they were right to be cautious all along. This self-fulfilling prophecy becomes their evidence that emotional distance was always the wisest choice. Understanding this pattern matters because it's happening in relationships everywhere, often invisible to both participants. The person being punished rarely recognizes the pattern for what it is, instead blaming themselves for being too needy, too sensitive, or too demanding. Meanwhile, the avoidant person remains unconscious of their own role in creating the very problems they claim to be avoiding. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Now, let's examine this pattern through the lens of someone who lived it, breathed it, and nearly drowned in it before finally coming up for air. Meet Sarah, a marketing executive who thought she had found her perfect match in David, a successful architect with an easy smile and an uncanny to make her feel both cherished and uncertain at the same time. Their early months together felt like something out of a romantic movie. Late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, spontaneous weekend getaways, and a connection that seemed to bypass all the usual relationship awkwardness. Sarah had always been drawn to confident, self-sufficient men, and David embodied those qualities perfectly. He was accomplished, independent, and refreshingly different from her previous partners who had seemed overly eager or clingy. What she didn't recognize at first was that David's independence wasn't just a personality trait. It was a carefully constructed defense system that had been decades in the making. The first crack in their perfect facade appeared after about 4 months. They had been spending most weekends together, and Sarah mentioned how much she enjoyed their routine of lazy Sunday mornings and shared coffee. David's response was immediate and jarring. He suddenly needed space. Not permanently, he assured her, just some time to think and breathe. He promised to call her in a few days, but those days stretched into a week, then 2. When they finally spoke, he was polite but distant, treating her like a pleasant acquaintance rather than someone who had been sharing his bed just weeks before. Sarah's confusion was understandable. She replayed every conversation, analyzed every moment, searching for the mistake she must have made. But here's what she couldn't see, what David himself barely understood. Her casual mention of their routine had triggered something primal in him. The word routine implied permanence, expectation, and a level of interdependence that made his nervous system scream danger. Rather than recognizing this as his own fear response, David's mind began constructing a different narrative. But the story was far from over, and what happened next would reveal the true nature of how avoidant guilt transforms into something much more destructive. David did eventually reach out, but not with an apology or explanation. Instead, he acted as though nothing had happened, suggesting they grab dinner like old friends might. When Sarah expressed hurt about his sudden disappearance, David's response was masterful in its subtle cruelty. He didn't deny her feelings or call her crazy. Instead, he expressed surprise that she had interpreted his need for space as anything problematic. After all, he reasoned, weren't they both independent adults who didn't need to be in constant contact? This response illustrates a cognitive bias called rationalization, the unconscious process of creating logical-sounding reasons for behavior that's actually driven by emotion or instinct. David's mind was working overtime to transform his fear-based withdrawal into a reasonable request for space, and Sarah's natural hurt response into evidence of neediness or overdependence. This mental gymnastics allowed him to avoid confronting his own discomfort while simultaneously making Sarah question her own perceptions and needs. The pattern that emerged over the following months was both subtle and devastating. David would periodically create distance, then return acting as though nothing significant had occurred. Each time Sarah tried to address the cycle, she was met with explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, but left her feeling confused and somehow at fault. He wasn't cruel or obviously manipulative. He was simply unavailable in ways that were difficult to pinpoint or confront directly. Here's where the guilt began its transformation into punishment. Deep down, David knew his behavior was hurtful. He could see the confusion in Sarah's eyes, notice how she had begun walking on eggshells around topics that might trigger another withdrawal. Part of him felt terrible about this impact, but admitting that guilt would require acknowledging that his behavior was wrong, which would then necessitate either changing it or accepting that he was actively hurting someone he cared about. Neither option felt acceptable to his avoidance system. Instead, his guilt began morphing into resentment towards Sarah for making him feel guilty in the first place. This psychological defense mechanism, known as reactive devaluation, caused him to unconsciously diminish her worth and importance in his mind. If she wasn't that important, then hurting her wasn't that serious. If she was being overly sensitive, then his behavior was justified. This mental shift allowed him to maintain his self-image as a good person while continuing behavior that was causing real harm. The punishment phase began subtly. David started responding to Sarah's messages hours later than usual, not out of genuine busyness, but as an unconscious way of maintaining control and distance. He became less physically affectionate, less emotionally available during conversations, and more likely to prioritize other activities over their time together. When Sarah planned something special for his birthday, he seemed distracted and unappreciative, later claiming he had never been someone who made a big deal about birthdays. Each of these behaviors served the dual purpose of creating the distance David craved, while also punishing Sarah for triggering his discomfort in the first place. Like Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl navigating the complex social hierarchies of Manhattan's elite, Sarah found herself constantly trying to read between the lines, searching for clues about what she had done wrong and how she might fix it. The most insidious aspect of this punishment was its deniability. When Sarah finally confronted David about feeling like he was pulling away, he could honestly say he hadn't been intentionally mean or cruel. His withdrawal wasn't conscious revenge, it was an unconscious system designed to regulate his own emotional comfort while expressing his resentment about feeling guilty. This unconscious nature made it nearly impossible to address directly, leaving Sarah feeling like she was fighting shadows. The climax of their story came during what should have been a celebration. Sarah had received a significant promotion at work, something she had been working toward for over a year. When she called David with the news, his response was polite but noticeably flat. He congratulated her in the same tone someone might use to acknowledge nice weather. When she suggested celebrating together, he mentioned that he already had plans but hoped she would have fun with her friends instead. This moment crystallized everything that had been building between them. Sarah finally recognized that she was in a relationship with someone who seemed to resent her happiness, her needs, and her very presence in his life. The man who had once stayed up all night talking with her about their dreams and fears was now treating her like an obligation he was trying to escape. But understanding David's perspective reveals the tragic nature of this pattern and why recognition is the first step toward healing for everyone involved. His guilt about repeatedly hurting Sarah had become so uncomfortable that punishing her felt like the only way to manage his own emotional distress. In his unconscious mind, if he could make her care less, want less, or need less from him, then his withdrawals wouldn't hurt her as much and he wouldn't have to feel guilty about them. Now that we understand how this destructive cycle operates, let's explore the practical steps that can help break these patterns, whether you recognize them in yourself or someone you care about. The first and most crucial step is developing awareness of the difference between healthy boundaries and punitive withdrawal. Healthy boundaries are communicated clearly, implemented with kindness, and designed to protect both people in the relationship. They sound like honest conversations about needs, limits, and expectations. Punitive withdrawal, on the other hand, involves creating distance as a form of emotional regulation or retaliation, without communication or consideration for the other person's experience. If you find yourself in the avoidant position, feeling guilty about hurting someone and tempted to create more distance to manage that discomfort, pause and examine what's really happening inside you. Guilt often signals that your behavior isn't aligned with your values. Instead of trying to eliminate the guilt by punishing or devaluing the other person, consider whether the guilt might be pointing toward an opportunity for growth or change. Ask yourself honestly whether your withdrawal is serving a legitimate need for space or whether it's an unconscious attempt to manage uncomfortable emotions. The practice of sitting with guilt without immediately acting to eliminate it can be transformative. Guilt about hurting someone often contains important information about the impact of your behavior and the kind of person you want to be in relationships. When you notice yourself beginning to resent someone for making you feel guilty, that's actually a signal that you're about to enter the punishment phase of this cycle. This awareness creates an opportunity to choose a different response. Consider the alternative of direct communication about your needs and fears. This requires vulnerability, which feels dangerous to avoidant systems, but it's infinitely more honest and less damaging than silent punishment. Instead of withdrawing and hoping the other person gets the message, try expressing your actual experience. This might sound like acknowledging that intimacy feels scary sometimes, that you need periodic space to maintain your sense of self, or that you're struggling with feelings of guilt about your impact on them. For those who find themselves on the receiving end of silent punishment, the most important skill to develop is the ability to distinguish between your own needs and someone else's emotional regulation. When someone consistently creates distance, becomes less available, or seems to resent your presence after moments of closeness, you're likely witnessing their attempt to manage their own discomfort rather than receiving accurate information about your worth or behavior. This distinction matters enormously because it prevents you from taking responsibility for emotional work that isn't yours to do. You cannot and should not try to manage your needs, emotions, or natural responses to intimacy in order to keep someone else comfortable. Attempting to do so only enables the pattern to continue while diminishing your own sense of self and emotional well-being. Instead, focus on maintaining your own emotional center while clearly communicating your observations and needs. This might involve pointing out patterns you've noticed, expressing how certain behaviors impact you, and stating clearly what kind of treatment you need in order to feel respected and valued in the relationship. This approach serves two purposes. It provides the other person with honest feedback about the impact of their behavior, and it maintains your own integrity and self-respect regardless of how they respond. The cognitive bias known as the fundamental attribution error often plays a significant role in how these situations unfold. This bias causes people to attribute their own behavior to external circumstances while attributing others' behavior to internal character flaws. The avoidant person sees their withdrawal as a reasonable response to feeling overwhelmed or pressured, while viewing their partner's hurt response as evidence of excessive neediness or emotional instability. Meanwhile, the person being withdrawn from often blames themselves for somehow causing the distance, while viewing the avoidant person's behavior as a reflection of their own inadequacy. Recognizing this bias can help both people develop a more accurate understanding of what's actually happening. The avoidant person's withdrawal is typically about their own discomfort with intimacy rather than something their partner has done wrong. The partner's hurt response is a natural reaction to emotional distance and inconsistency rather than evidence of excessive neediness. This clearer perspective creates space for more productive conversations about actual needs and fears rather than defensive reactions and blame. Another practical strategy involves learning to identify and interrupt the guilt-to-punishment transformation before it gains momentum. For avoidant individuals, this means developing tolerance for the discomfort of feeling guilty about hurting someone. Guilt doesn't have to be eliminated immediately through distance, rationalization, or punishment. It can simply be acknowledged as information about your impact on someone you care about. Practice sitting with the thought that you might be hurting someone without immediately defending against that possibility or finding ways to make it their fault. This emotional tolerance is a skill that develops with practice, and it's essential for maintaining authentic connections with other people. When you notice yourself beginning to find fault with someone after feeling close to them, recognize this as a potential sign that you're trying to manage guilt or discomfort through devaluation. The person experiencing silent punishment can practice holding space for both their own hurt and the other person's struggle without trying to fix or manage either. This means acknowledging that their hurt is valid and deserves attention, while also recognizing that the other person's behavior is likely driven by their own fears and limitations rather than an accurate assessment of your worth. This balanced perspective prevents the common trap of either dismissing your own needs to accommodate someone else's limitations or taking complete responsibility for fixing their emotional discomfort. Both responses enable the destructive pattern to continue while preventing genuine intimacy and mutual respect from developing. Learning to communicate about these patterns directly without blame or demands for immediate change can sometimes create openings for genuine connection and understanding. This might involve sharing observations about cycles you've noticed, expressing your own needs and limits clearly, and asking curious questions about the other person's experience rather than making assumptions about their motivations. However, it's crucial to understand that awareness and communication don't automatically lead to change. The avoidant punishment pattern serves important psychological functions for the person engaging in it, and changing these deeply ingrained responses requires significant motivation and usually professional support. Your role is not to diagnose, fix, or cure someone else's attachment patterns, but rather to maintain your own emotional health and make informed decisions about what kind of relationship dynamics you're willing to accept in your life. Setting clear boundaries about treatment you won't accept is often more effective than trying to convince someone to change their behavior. This means being willing to limit your investment in relationships that consistently involve emotional withdrawal, punishment for intimacy, or cycles of closeness followed by rejection. These boundaries protect your emotional well-being while also providing clear feedback about the consequences of these behavioral patterns. The most challenging aspect of this work is learning to maintain compassion for someone's struggles while still holding them accountable for their impact on you. Someone can be genuinely struggling with intimacy fears and trauma responses while also causing real harm through their behavior. Both things can be true simultaneously, and acknowledging someone's internal struggle doesn't mean accepting treatment that damages your sense of self or emotional well-being. Understanding the patterns we've explored today offers a pathway toward healthier relationships, whether you recognize these behaviors in yourself or someone you care about. The transformation of avoidant guilt into silent punishment represents one of the most common yet misunderstood dynamics in modern relationships, leaving countless people confused, hurt, and blaming themselves for problems they didn't create and cannot fix alone. The journey toward breaking these cycles begins with recognition, seeing the patterns clearly without immediately trying to fix or change them. Like Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You, who creates elaborate justifications for his controlling behavior, people caught in avoidant punishment patterns often have sophisticated internal narratives that make their behavior seem reasonable and necessary. Challenging these narratives requires courage, honesty, and often professional support. For those who recognize avoidant tendencies in themselves, the path forward involves developing tolerance for the discomfort of intimacy and guilt, rather than immediately acting to eliminate these feelings through distance or punishment. This means learning to sit with the scary feeling of being truly known by another person, accepting that caring about someone inevitably involves the risk of hurting them, and choosing vulnerability over.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.